the shutter speed priority mode is the most important mode for videographers. There is the rule of doubling your frame rates. That means if your frame rate is 30 frames per second, you want to be shooting on a shutter speed of 1/60. If you're shooting at 25 frames per second, you want to use a 1/50 shutter speed. Your shutter speed sort of, when you're working on video, seems constant most times. That's a rule of thumb. Most times you want to set your ISO to the lowest possible on your camera, your native ISO, which for low budget or mid budget cameras is always the lowest ISO your camera can do. My camera can do an ISO 100, and that is the most common native ISO for most cameras. Now, what shutter speed priority mode does that I love is that it sets your aperture for you. And even if you want to set your aperture yourself, even if I want to set my aperture myself, I know that my ISO is somewhat constant. If I'm shooting a video, I want to do the lowest ISO. And for my shutter speed, I'm doubling my frame rate. That means then 1/double of my frame rate. The only variable I have to tweak in my video to get the right exposure is my aperture. Amazingly, the camera, because I am in shutter speed mode, the camera will set an aperture for me. So if the camera sets an aperture for me, it will get the exposure right. And modern cameras, unlike the first set of digital cameras, are pretty good with getting maybe like the aperture right. So after setting the shutter speed and ISO, I have pressed my shutter button. So if I have pressed my shutter button, it will show me the aperture that the camera selected for me. So if it shows me the aperture, for example, if it shows me 1.2 and the 1.2 is static, it has gotten the right composition given the light and everything on my frame. So I can hit the start button on my camera to lock that so it doesn't keep changing it, though I forgot to do that in this particular video. That's why the shutter speed priority, in my opinion, is the best. So if it is not able to get the right exposure given the limitation of your lens, probably it wants to shoot at, presently this one is shooting at an aperture of f1.2. If your lens cannot do 1.2, what the camera will start doing for you, it will start blinking the last aperture value on your camera. So you don't need to buy another lens if you don't have that. For example, even as low as this aperture is, there are sometimes I set it and then it's blinking the f1.2. That means that I have maxed out the values I can play with on the camera. So what I do is to come to my light so I can control things outside of my camera. I can increase the intensity of my light. For example, this light is a 200 watt light. At 100%, it will be too much to make it too bright. Although I have an ND filter, but I don't need to use an ND filter indoor. So it will consume more power. So what I do is to reduce the intensity of the light maybe to 10% of its actual power. So that's how I actually start my video, do 10% of its actual power. Then if after setting the exposure, I've gotten to my lowest aperture, I realize that it is still flashing. That means it's flashing the number, blinking the number. So I'll come to my light and increase it by 10 or 20. Maybe I can do 30% of its actual power. Then I go back to, I've pressed my shutter speed, and most times doing that just works. So it saves me electric bill because I don't have to just trust my ancestors, just guess a random number and it looks good to the eyes. The human eyes is good, the human brain is very good, but sometimes like it is subjective. You know, the camera is doing a lot of mathematical calculations given the light it has available to you. And this is why I think the shutter speed priority is the best mode every person shooting video should shoot at, except in cases where you want to achieve a particular creative effect. For example, you want a shallower depth of field. Maybe the camera, after you have set the ISO to 100 and then you've set your shutter speed to 1/double of your frame rate per second. You remember that rule? Now you have just the aperture. Maybe the camera is suggesting 2.8 for you, but you want to do 1.8 because you want control over your aperture. So you have to do that in manual. Then if you want to achieve that with this, there is the exposure compensation, but I don't see the point. I would rather just do manual instead of doing exposure compensation in shutter speed priority. That's just my own personal opinion. I'm not an OG in photography and videography. I know things I am an OG at. What camera modes do you shoot in the most?